What makes the achievement of emotional sobriety so difficult is the habits we have, the patterns we have in our behavior, the habitual ways that we've come to think about things. We have to really become aware of those things in order to challenge them, because the consciousness that has created a lot of the problems in our life cannot solve it, cannot change things. So what happens is the first step is waking up. So last week we were just kind of kicking this around, and we decided that we would task ourselves with now exploring how the 12 steps impact and help facilitate the development of self-esteem. Now, self-esteem, I think, you can almost think about self-esteem as being dependent on emotional sobriety, and emotional sobriety being dependent on self-esteem. So they're so related, just like differentiation. That concept is just another way of understanding this stuff. So what we're going to do tonight is Roger wants to finish up his introduction with a few comments. Herb is going to introduce us to the workings of step one and start to talk about self-esteem from his point of view in terms of how this step, impacts the development of our self-esteem. Roger will come in and share his thoughts about it, and I will do that. And then we will open up the group for some discussion. So we're going to be doing step one now for the next few weeks. And we'll do it as step one as long as we need to do it. And then we'll shift over to step two and so on and so forth through the next 12 steps. So welcome to this fantastic journey. And Roger, let me invite you in and give you the floor.
Thank you, Al, very much for those kind words, man. And welcome, everyone. I, too, am excited to continue talking about self-esteem and emotional sobriety tonight, and bringing in its step one and its relationship to self-esteem more specifically. Alan mentioned Nathaniel Branden. For those of you who weren't here last week, as well as those of you who were, Nathaniel Branden was my mentor in the area of self-esteem and psychology, psychotherapy. I moved out here in 1972 from the Midwest in order to do personal therapy for myself with Dr. Branden, as well as study and train with him in an informal training seminar that he conducted. So I did want to add a couple of thoughts to what I had shared last week that I didn't have time for last week. As a reminder, Dr. Branden defines self-esteem in this way. He defines it as the integration, the coming together of two primary elements. One is our level or degree of self-respect, which includes our sense of self-worth. So he kind of merges those together as one of the central defining characteristics of self-esteem. The other is our self-confidence. So those are the two central ideas: self-respect and self-confidence. Another way he worded that is self-esteem is our sense of our ability to, how competent are we? How capable are we of dealing with the challenges of life? That's the self-confidence piece. And how worthy do we feel of happiness in our lives? That's the self-respect, worthiness piece. Now, he identified 6 pillars or practices that constitute self-esteem as well. 6 practices that, when we engage in them regularly, will build our sense of self-respect and our sense of self-confidence. To briefly go over those again, it was the decision or choice to live consciously, our degree of self-acceptance, how much responsibility we are willing and able to take in our lives. Self-assertiveness is the 4th pillar or practice that he mentioned. How able am I to express my wants and needs and opinions and take action to meet them? Number 5 is living purposefully. What's my sense of my purpose in life? And number 6 is the practice of personal integrity. So mainly what I wanted to add tonight is, over the years, I've given a lot of thought to the area of self-esteem, and I would add a couple of additional concepts, a couple of additional pillars or practices. Both of these are contained at more of an implicit level than an explicit level in Nathaniel's writings, but I think they are more than worthy of being considered in themselves. So the first one that I would add is more of a focus on the practice and pillar of humility. A few years ago, Alan and I were together talking about some ideas around self-esteem, and we hit upon the idea of humility-based self-esteem. Humility-based self-esteem. And the appeal of that idea to me for a long time is it very quickly and directly begins to counter an image or a notion many of us might have about self-esteem as being confused with arrogance, or being confused with boastfulness, or a need to put other people down in order to build oneself up. And I quoted some material from Nathaniel Branden last week that makes clear that he views all of those ideas, putting others down in order to build ourselves up, going out of our way to demonstrate our superiority in some way or other to another person. He views all of those things as evidence of deficiencies of self-esteem, as a lack of self-esteem. And I feel that grounding our notions of self-esteem in humility really brings down to earth the idea of self-esteem in a very helpful way. It lets go of a lot of ideas of grandiosity or exaggeration of achievements, all of those kinds of ideas that sometimes in our minds we can confuse with genuine self-esteem, but are not the same. For me, genuine self-esteem has no need to advertise itself, okay? It has no need to proclaim itself in the world. And so remember the definition that Alan has brought from the American Psychological Association. Self-esteem is characterized by a relatively low focus on oneself, an accurate, which means not over or underestimated, sense of one's accomplishments and worth, and acknowledgement of our limitations, our imperfections, our mistakes, gaps in knowledge, and so on. So this again points to me, the idea that we don't have to be perfect in our life. We don't have to be perfect in our self-esteem in order to, in some fundamental way, still experience ourselves and view ourselves as worthy of self-respect, as worthy of a sense of competence, and worthy of a sense of self-confidence. Perfectionism has no place here. And I feel like a focus on humility really emphasizes that. The second idea I would add is a greater focus on relationship and connection than Nathaniel's 6 pillars specify. He gives a lot of attention to the importance of relationship and how self-esteem impacts our relationships, or a lack of self-esteem impacts our relationship. But to me, the notion of relationship and connection in the building of our sense of self-worth and in the expression of our sense of self-worth is very much worth separate and explicit emphasis for him. I'll quote Erich Fromm's message again that I mentioned many months ago. Love, wrote Erich Fromm, is the active power in man, a power which breaks through the walls which separates man from his fellow man, which unites him with others. Love makes him overcome the sense of isolation and separateness, yet it permits him to be himself, to retain his integrity. So to me, a focus on connection and relatedness in self-esteem, both again in the formation of our sense of self-worth and in the expression of it, is central. Rightfully so, that Nathaniel focuses so much on individualism, on individuation, he calls it, which we're referring to as differentiation, because that is so central to our psychological development and to our relationship functioning and to emotional sobriety. But still, I'd rather focus more on the way that we have been talking about this, that it's a matter of balancing a focus on self with a focus on relationship, that both of those needs need to be addressed in our life. And so that's primarily what I wanted to add, is the idea of those two additional pillars, humility and relatedness or connection. I feel like expanding the pillars to include those two things also really lends itself to connecting up the 12 steps to self-esteem. So on that note, I will defer to Herb, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts, Herb.
Oh, wonderful, Roger. Thank you so much. My name is Herb, and I'm an alcoholic. I'm really honored and appreciate the opportunity to share my knowledge and my experience with this. Again, going back to last week, thanks so much, Roger, for your presentation. It was very stimulating, and then for your wrap up today. In fact, I went back to my library because I knew I had the book, 6 Pillars. And when I took it out of the dusty cabinet, I hadn't looked at it for a while. I didn't even know I read it. But when I started looking at it, it was filled with underlines and margin notes and all kinds of things. So clearly, a couple decades ago, I had looked at it, probably as a result of Dr. Berger's recommendation at one point. And he has, I'm going to recommend something. He has 6 pillars, absolutely. But then his final chapter is pillar number 7. And I read that, and don't overlook a pillar number 7. In fact, if you are interested in the book and you get it, read that first. Read the pillar number 7. I'm actually, since I have it here, I'm going to say, he says, pillar number 7 is the launching pad for this journey of improving, maybe identifying, improving your self-esteem. And he calls it love, a hackneyed term that fortunately he gives us a qualifier for. He says willingness and a will to, willingness and a will to live the 6 pillars. The 7th pillar is the willingness to actually do that. And I thought that was just brilliant. And he says that summons the hero in us because it takes effort and work to generate and sustain this awareness, which is pillar number 1, which I can see as the door that opens it all up. The 12-step methodology, and that's what it really is, a methodology for human change, for human transformation, for enlightenment. The various words, some of them are actually in the literature. Enlightenment probably isn't. But step 12 tells us specifically what the purpose is of the 12-step methodology. Some people don't pay attention to that as much. I start actually with individuals and with groups looking at step 12 because it tells us what the mission is, what the purpose is, what's the value proposition, having had a spiritual awakening. Well, this sounds kind of a new agey, a spiritual awakening. What he means in that is discussed in the big book in Appendix 2. It's just a change. No, not just. It is a change, a radical change in the way we think and feel and behave. That's what this is about. This is the door that opens us to I didn't know that I didn't know, and I couldn't see that I didn't see until, in fact, suffering brought me to a 12-step program. Suffering brings, to the best of my knowledge, each person in any one of the 12-step programs, whether that's a substance addiction or a process addiction, the suffering brings us to search for a solution to reduce and eliminate the suffering. I loved your definition of self-esteem. Oh, well, it comes from the book and your teacher, my reputation with myself. Well, Dr. Berger and I talk about that in emotional sobriety as the story. That's the story. And I don't know I have a story. Age 48 years old, 4 years sober. Lots of background, retrospective, introspective education. I didn't know I had a story. I didn't know that I had a story, and I was invested in my story. And my story was the source of my suffering. And you talked about it, Roger, in the way I like to talk about it. It's the lens through which we look. All right, my beliefs that have been hammered out on the anvil of our own experience, some of it genetic, some of it cultural, some of it educational, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that develops this, as you said, that our sense of self-esteem or self-worth or self-confidence or self-respect or none of those. And they're frozen. This is my word that captures at age 48, 4 years sober. I was going in meetings and talking to a sponsor and reading the literature and et cetera, et cetera. But I was frozen. And it took me a while to thaw out physically in order to hear somebody share in a way that I knew that they knew, and that they had somehow successfully navigated the 12 steps in a way that I had never been exposed to before. That man helped me. I needed a teacher. I needed a teacher to help me read the English in the big book. I'm reasonably intelligent, fairly well educated. I read English. I could not read the big book and understand its direction. It was kind of like this man became my Rosetta Stone. That's a stone that was found that allowed people to interpret the hieroglyphics in Egypt when they uncovered this ancient stuff. It was a stone that decoded. This man helped me decode these 12 steps. So when it came to the first step, admitted we were powerless over alcohol, well, I said, 4 years ago, I'm an alcoholic. Sure, I'm powerless. Look at my 502s and difficulties with my life and blackouts and embarrassing moments and drama. Drama made me an alcoholic, he said. My father was an alcoholic. Genetics, I kind of knew that, made me an alcoholic. None of that was true. Well, maybe the genetics part, but drama did not make me an alcoholic. This man, and then subsequently, 2 different men and 2 more journeys through the steps, unpacked what I'm going to unpack to you in about 5 minutes. It took me 8 years to understand it and to experience it. But you'll get the gist of it. Admitted we were powerless over alcohol. First half of the first step. Powerless. Let's look at that word. Breathe, please. You think you know what powerless means because you heard it so often. Oh, I'm powerless. People, places, and things, they say, blah, 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 blah. Think about what you're saying. Yeah, people, yes. Places and things. That doesn't even make any sense. Stop saying it. Circumstances and events. Absolutely. Powerless. Challenge yourself. Means no power. Yeah. No. No choice. I have no personal human power or choice over my addiction. Oh yeah, okay, I get that. Sure, look at my history, I can tell you. Once I start, I cannot stop. Yep, the big book handles that in the doctor's opinion. It's a body problem. Probably that's the genetics at work. I don't speculate about that. I don't have that kind of background. But the doctor's opinion says he's a medical doctor. We have a body problem that it looks like an allergy. Looks like he's not a scientist. He's not doing research here. He just has an opinion. He's a medical doctor. When I eat strawberries, I break out in red lumps. I eat a strawberry, I break out in red lumps. That's what he means. When I take a drink, I'll take a second drink. Well, yeah, I chose to have a second drink. Really? Really? Drug of choice. Really? Really? When I eat a strawberry, I don't have a choice. I'm going to break out in, see, that's the metaphor or analogy, whatever it is. Allergy. But he uses the term craving. Oh yeah, you've heard the words before. Maybe you've heard the explanation before, but take a really deep look at the big book and it says the craving never happens till after you ingest the alcohol. The craving never happens until after you ingest the food. The craving never happens until after you make the bet. The craving never happens until after you pull the trigger. So the real definition of craving is very unique to the big book. It's a biological mandate, a biological imperative. It's a chemistry change. When I put the chemical of alcohol into the chemistry of herb, the two chemistries mix and create and pull the trigger so that my cellular structure demands more alcohol. It's no longer emotions, it's no longer conscious, it's no longer willpower. It's biochemical. At least this is my interpretation of it. Therefore, powerless, no choice, because it's a biological phenomena. Well, Bill says very clearly, page 23, if you want to check it out, well, then stop. Herb, blackouts and jails and suffering, stop it. Well, he says, so obviously, I don't stop. So the mind is the problem. See, there's two parts to addiction. The body problem is only a problem if I ingest or take the action for a substance or process addiction. I can't stop and stay stopped. That's the issue. There's only two relevant questions as I understand it from the big book. When you start, do you lose control? When you stop, do you stay stopped? People I've had this conversation with say, oh yeah, Herb, I quit for 2 years. The operating phrase is past tense. I quit for 10 years. The operating phrase is past tense. If you quit and started, you didn't quit. I don't care if it's a weekend or a week or a decade or 2 decades. If you quit and started, you didn't quit. So he says the only real evaluation here is what were you thinking before you engaged in the process or the substance? What were you, the 2 minutes before? And some people will have an excuse. Well, it'll be different this time. Or I've been sober for a year. I think I've got this. Or it won't hurt me this time. You've heard Dr. Berger talk about insanity. And we've heard it in the meetings in this way, doing the same thing over again, expecting different results. But Dr. Berger ups the ante, doing same things over and over and over again, expecting better results. Oh my God, that's real insanity because it's never true. When we look back, if we were able to look at the truth, and we're not, I wasn't able to. And I look back over my shoulder, I would see that it's never better. It's not even the same. It progressively got worse over those 20 years of my drinking. And that's what Bill Wilson means by insanity in the big book. It comes from the Latin sanus. He doesn't say this, but he uses the term on page 37. If you want to know what the big book means by insanity, it's really relevant to step 2. We'll look at that in a while. Restored to sanity has nothing to do with psychology or psychiatry. It has everything to do with balance. It has everything to do with health. Sanus in Latin means health. When you put an IN in front of it, it means not healthy. That's all it means. And Bill says a lack of perspective. So when Roger talks about humility, this is now, well, we need to understand humility comes from the Latin word humus, which means earth or dirt, not in a diminishing sense, but common as, not unique, not outstanding, one of many. Humility. One of the authors in my religious tradition talks about humility is truth. It's a profound statement. Perspective on reality. That's why this emotional sobriety work that we're doing is so important, because it's about the truth and it's about accepting reality as it is, not as our story dictates, not as we want it, not as we feel it, not as we've been told it. It just is what it is. And you've heard us talk about reality is what it is, but only 100% of the time. Now, this is about addiction, first half of the first step. I'm going to wrap it because I know I don't want to. I'm going to use Tom's time, I guess, a little bit. But anyway, but our life had become unmanageable. So many people think that there's a connection. If there was a connection, an intended connection, I do believe Bill was very schooled in English grammar. Proud of it. Mentioned it many times in his talks. He uses different words in consecutive sentences because that's what he was taught in his English courses. If he wanted addiction to be connected to unmanageability, he would have said, my life, I've been admitted we were addicts, powerless over alcohol, and our life was unmanageable. But he didn't. There's no and there. It's a dash. New thought. Still powerless. We're under the flagship of powerless, no choice. Addiction clearly, physically and mentally, but now he's talking about, I won't even use the word, although Roger made a great case for relationship. For me, that's a synonym for spirituality. Spirituality is a relationship with life, a relationship with myself, a relationship with other people. That pretty much is a wrap on reality, a relationship, spirituality. Are we spiritual beings seeking a human experience or human beings seeking a spiritual experience? And wonderful for debate. In my meditation, the answer was yes. Yes, I'm both. I mean, in the sense that I need a relationship with life. I need a relationship with myself. I need a relationship with others if I'm going to live in a sense of contentment, conscious contentment. Unmanageability is I'm not aware that I'm not aware. I don't see that I don't see. And I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. And if that sounds familiar, you're probably familiar with the Christian scripture, St. Paul. I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. That's the thorn in my side, he said. Right? He was just experiencing what we experience as human beings, life manifesting in a way that is uncomfortable for us. But it doesn't meet up with my story. It doesn't meet up with my expectations. And Bill Wilson says the heart, the root of that problem is self-centeredness. It's not a negative term. It's an explanation. My free will is not free in this area. My free will on its own power will choose me. I'm a narcissist, that's very clear, but it's a human condition. And maybe that's why so many people relate to some connotation of the 9 characteristics of narcissism, because each one of us humans have that self-will run riot that Bill talks about. In fact, he says, everybody has self-centeredness addicts, I'm substituting a word for alcoholics, addicts are extreme examples of self-will run, maybe because of the addiction problem. And on page 62, as he does on page 43, with regard to addiction on page 43, we have no effective mental defense against the first drink. We need a power other than ourselves. On page 62, with regard to unmanageability, check that end of that second paragraph. We can't even reduce our self-centeredness by wishing or trying on our own power. I'll end with this. Dr. Nathaniel Branden says that pillar number 7, that willingness, he calls it the launching pad. The launching pad for self-esteem, for development of self-esteem. All right. And he talks about willingness as that 7th pillar. Bill calls it the cornerstone. The cornerstone of a spiritual arch through which we walk to a new freedom. A freedom to have a relationship with life. A freedom to have a relationship with myself. A freedom to have a relationship with other people. As long as we do the balance of the work and then sustain it. I have 5 pages of notes. As you know, Alan, I could go on for a while. So
let's keep them. We'll continue this discussion next week. I mean, look, I was thinking if is there a fire extinguisher close by because you're on fire.
Wow.
I've been all day on this.
That's right. Wonderful, man. I got goosebumps right sitting here. I just love.
Now, Roger pulled the curtain back and I walked into the room.
Listen, we're going to keep on step 1 for a while, so we'll continue this on. Raj, why don't you jump in and then I'll jump in with a few comments.
Well, I tell you what I would prefer to do now. I've had some time tonight to talk about a couple ideas. I would rather hold off and give you a chance to speak, because I do have some thoughts about tying step 1 into self-esteem.
Well, like I said, we'll continue it next week.
We can do it next week, but go ahead, Al.
Okay. Yeah. Well, look.
The point, in case I missed it, was humility. By the way, go ahead.
No, and what an important addition that you brought in, and I remember our discussion about that humility-based self-esteem. The step 1, if you read the 12 and 12, really it's Bill, really puts it, I think, in the proper perspective. That this is the bedrock upon which the rest of the program is going to be built. That's how he describes it, and that we want a firm bedrock, and so that's the critical part of this. But what I wanted to address tonight in this, and we'll get into what happens in the self-esteem involved, but he said something that I thought was really worth taking out and looking at. He says, when first challenged to admit defeat, this is the person coming in the program that's asked to admit their powerlessness. He says, most of us revolted. There is a resistance to accepting defeat.
Yeah.
Defeat sounds like we're losing. Surrender in a military situation is a terrible thing. You've lost the battle. Now, surrendering to the love of another person can be a wonderful thing. But most of us revolted because we've got to understand the consciousness that we're bringing into the journey that we're starting here. You've heard Herb and I talk a lot about the trance that we all live in, that we're dreaming that we're awake when we're really asleep, kind of a thing. Now, what does that mean in terms of this whole thing? Well, one of the things that gets challenged right from the beginning is our whole belief about who we are, what's important, our ideas, our attitudes towards ourselves, towards life, and towards our relationships. And those attitudes were problematic. That's why we ended up coming to AA, is that the way that we were living our life that started early on, even if it was 1 degree early on when we were 5. By the time we get to 35, that 1 degree turns into 30 degrees, and we miss the mark completely. But we never realize it. Because you said it many times, Herb, I don't know that I'm looking at life through a lens until I take off and start to see these lenses. But these lenses are a part of my consciousness, and I don't realize there's another possibility. So when Bill says we revolt, he says what happens is most of us go to AA expecting we're going to learn self-confidence.
Right.
Which means we are going to learn to use our attitudes and beliefs that we're bringing into the program, and we're going to just kind of, supercharge them and now deal with life. That's not what happens. Trying harder when you're doing something wrong is not going to make it right. I mean, it's just not going to work, no matter what tricks you try, no matter what games you play with yourself. And now, unfortunately, Roger, you and I and Herb have seen so many people come in and they try to work the program and not make any changes.
Right.
I mean, good luck with that. I mean, it just doesn't work. Now, how does this relate to self-esteem? And I think you guys have both really already started to tie it together. And I love that you brought in this seventh pillar. I mean, that was, I forgot about it until you just said it. Yeah. But it really is the launching pad. And that's what, in many ways, Bill says this. Listen, little good can come to any alcoholic who joins AA unless he has accepted his devastating weakness. I put in place of weakness, his limitation, right? And all of its consequences. Now, that means looking at ourselves in a different way. Not that we're losing something when we accept our limitation, but now I'm going to bring in a new concept. The concept of false pride. It used to be called neurotic pride. Oh. Neurotic pride or false pride, is when I believe I have to be a certain way to be okay. We will define that as an allegiance to an ideal or an idea. That's what neurotic pride is. It's an allegiance to an ideal or an idea, not an allegiance to our humanity.
Yes.
Towards our reality. See, that's true pride, right? Because pride is self-esteem, real or imagined. So this does bring the question is a lot of us had neurotic pride, which meant that our self-esteem was neurotic because it was based on a lot of things that were not true. They were not. It was not based on humility. It was not based on the truth of our existence. It was based on a fantasy of how we would like things to be. And there was always an unwillingness to see ourselves as we were.
Yes.
Now, cracking that cosmic egg, I mean, is a challenge. And, Bill, in a wonderful way, talks about how every step is about deflating the ego, which is all about the achievement of humility.
Yeah.
And I love how you tied that in, Roger, because we will build on that whole thing about humility and self-esteem, because that's one of the powerful forces that are taking place as we work the steps.
Well, that's why I like the connection between humility, by the way. Yeah.
Right on, right? It's the cultivation of that, is the tilling the soil to allow that to grow, which means taking these glasses off and saying, wait a minute, I may have I need a new prescription. I'm not seeing things well. This one is not working. I can't read that small print anymore. Something's missing here in my life because of it.
I hear a lot of people criticize the 12 steps, that they're old-fashioned. I can understand that criticism. They were written back in 1935. Some people that are agnostic have difficulty with the word God used in the steps. For me, I look at the process that's involved. The forces that the 12 steps generate are so powerful that I think they're ageless. There's this interesting phenomena that happens when you work the steps. They create a charge and then a discharge. You know, the first step, we're powerless. Our life has become unmanageable. It creates this charge. You know, we're in big trouble and we don't know what to do. And then step 2 comes along and it says we have hope. That charge, that existential crisis that we have is resolved. What's happening here is parallel to life. We charge ourselves when we breathe in. When we exhale, we discharge. That's the rhythm of life. And the way I love to think about the 12 steps, it's helping us get connected to the rhythm of life so we can learn how to show up in a good way.